Hello and welcome to this Ramadan Conversation. We're all in this together. It's presented by the Affinity Intercultural Foundation of Australia. I'm John Cleary and I'll be hosting this series of conversations presented throughout Ramadan. Yesterday, our program came from Hong Kong, and today's episode is especially important as it's in recognition of World Press Freedom Day. What's the connection between press freedom and religion, you ask? Well, that's a question we'll explore a little later. We're back in Sydney tonight, but we're also going global with a special guest from Washington, DC. Ramadan is, of course, characterised by the iftar meal, the breaking of bread amongst friends and neighbours. Last year, Affinity hosted 45 house iftars and 10 institutional iftars, including up to 350 guests. This year, COVID-19 has made that impossible, so Affinity has decided to carry Ramadan to an online platform, Ramadan Conversations. It's a daily 1-hour live conversation, and each episode will be live streamed, and later you can upload it on Affinity's YouTube page. And as a former ABC broadcaster with a special interest in religion, it's my great pleasure to host these conversations, together with a number of assistant hosts drawn from the Muslim community to assist us. Tonight, we're joined by Mr. Mehmet Sarl. Mehmet is by training a telecommunications engineer, but by commitment, he's the president and co-founder of Advocacy for Dignity, an organisation promoting the rule of law, democracy and human rights. He is also a co-founder, past president and current board member of the Affinity Intercultural Foundation, who of course are bringing you this program. Mehmet, good to see you.
Thank you, John. Great to be with you tonight.
Mehmet, many of our viewers may not be familiar with Affinity and its work, so can you give us a brief overview?
Yes, Affinity was established back in 2000, prior to September 11, I have to emphasize, and I'm really proud to say that. Our mission was to create and sustain relationships with people of the other faiths or cultures, to bring people together from different backgrounds in a platform of understanding, in a lecture series and talks, in lunches, dinners. We break bread together. So our aim was to, break down the barriers between communities, people, religions, and in the sphere of Australia. And we've done a great job in 20 years. We've come a long way. We have established really strong relationships. And I remember when one of the professors at the university did a study on Affinity, he said that when he did a survey on how many people knew Affinity in the state of New South Wales, he said 20% knew Affinity, the name Affinity. So it's a pretty big, it's been publicised pretty well, I think.
And it's a terrific ideal. Now, you're still connected with Affinity, but you've been a part founder as an organisation called Advocacy for Dignity. What is that, and what sort of ambit does it have? What's the brief for the organisation?
Yeah, as you said earlier, John, we're obviously trying to promote rule of law and democracy and human rights and civil liberties. And we're looking at different countries that Australians have come from. And the country that we have a special focus on, Turkey at the moment, and its citizens. The reason why we chose Turkey as the country that we'll target first is because Turkey was once a very successful democracy where Islam, democracy and modernity coexisted with no issues whatsoever. And that was only a decade ago that was a reality. And it was the example for the whole world to see. And Turkey is a country with 80 million citizens, and unfortunately it's experienced a dramatic decline in democracy and human rights, obviously, and swaying towards a very despotic leadership. It is where 200 journalists are jailed and 200 media outlets that have been terminated. A lot of people have lost their jobs, and it ranks as 154th out of 180 countries in the World Press Freedom Index, which shows to you how bad it has become since the Erdogan regime came into power back in 2002. It was 99. And also, I think Turkey is a country that a lot of Australians don't know too much about. They know Turkey is a very nice, great touristic destination, but they don't know too much about what's happening in Turkey, the injustices that are taking place. A lot of Australians don't know anything about that. They do know about Syria, they know about China, Egypt, etc. So I think we need to educate the Australian community as to what's happening in our home country.
We may touch on some of those things a little later this evening. So it's time now, though, to turn to our special guests. And first tonight is Professor Monica Attard. She's head of journalism at the University of Technology in Sydney. Much of Monica's eventful career was spent with our national broadcaster, the ABC, both as a foreign correspondent and with such leading programs as Four Corners and Lateline. Following the ABC, Monica became the foundation editor of the website The Global Mail, and she's currently the head of journalism at the University of Technology in Sydney. Over that distinguished career, Monica was the recipient of 5 Walkley Awards for excellence in journalism, including the coveted Gold Walkley. In recognition of her services to journalism, Monica is also the recipient of the Order of Australia. Monica, good to see you.
You too, John. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Monica, you've spent much of your journalistic career as a TV and radio reporter in Australia and around the world. So everybody wants to know this, of course. Just briefly give us an idea of a couple of your most valued moments.
Well, look, I always considered that I'm one of the luckiest people in the world for so much of my career. 99.9% of it, I've woken up every day thinking how very lucky I am to have the job that I had, at the particular time. I spent some 30 years at the ABC, an institution I love, one of the most important cultural institutions in Australia. The highlights, there are very, very, very many of them. Obviously being posted to Russia at the time that I was posted was really special. I was so lucky to have been posted at such a young age and at a critical time. The Berlin Wall had just fallen. Reforms were proceeding at pace in Russia itself. And, it was an incredibly exciting, invigorating time, if frightening time, to be there. And so I was there for 5 years as a correspondent, and during that time I covered many civil wars, in fact 8 civil wars across the old Soviet Union. I covered the collapse of communism, the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of Russia, the First Chechen War. It was an incredibly adventurous and exciting time. I do remember vividly when I came back to Australia and I was hosting PM, and after a month of sitting in a studio, tied up, cooped up in a studio, thinking, I don't know that I actually want to be here. I think I want to be back in a revolution somewhere. But it was a pretty exciting posting, and you couldn't have been there at a better time, historically speaking, because of course you literally, as most journalists would say, have a front row seat in the making of history, and that's pretty big. But I have had other wonderful experiences as a journalist in Australia. And for me, one of the most memorable experiences was doing a program which you would remember me doing, John, because I sat not very far away from you when I was doing it, which was Sunday Profile. And I loved doing that program because it was a half-hour interview every week with a newsmaker, and I worked with some wonderful producers, one in particular, Jennifer Feller, who is now a producer on Australian Story. And, we had the most incredible time tracking down people who were important in the news business at the time, and spending a lot of time digging and exploring the particular issue that they were at the heart of. And it was a really, really good program. It grieves me that it doesn't, it's still not on air, but it was a great program and it was a lot of fun to do.
Yeah. Mehmet, perhaps I could invite you to ask Monica a question. Yeah.
Yes, Monica, I was, because World Press Freedom Day today, I think it's best to talk about the World Press Freedom Index. Australia has dropped 5 places, from 21st in 2019 to 26th in 2020. And what would you put that down to? Why did Australia drop 5 places in just the space of 12 months?
Yeah, it's not great. It's not great news. I mean, I think that there are probably many factors contributing to that. I mean, we've had federal police raids on, in one case, the home of a News Corp journalist, Annika Smethurst. We've had raids on the ABC in relation to a program that the government was wanting to find out the source of. So we've had those kinds of fears instilled into our journalists. They were very, very chilling events. We've had heavy-handed national security laws, which are a barrier to freedom of information. And we've got an archaic defamation system that is, incredibly difficult to overcome and to steer through if you're a working journalist. And of course, we have I think you'd have to say a culture of government secrecy in this country. I think there was most notably a New York Times article many, many months ago now, probably 6 months ago, and the headline was, "Is this the world's most secretive government?" Now, I mean, clearly Australia is not the world's most secretive government, but our government is a fairly closed organisation. And so I think those factors have contributed to our slide down in the World Press Freedom rankings. And ultimately, of course, our democracy suffers, which is the worst thing of all.
Monica, Peter George, who you'd well remember, one of the ABC's inaugural reporters on foreign correspondent.
Remember him well.
He said in the 2019 Defend Media Freedom Forum, and I'll give you the quote, "As infringements on media freedoms increase, corruption in the public and private spheres increases while democratic freedoms diminish." How do you respond to that in the light of
I think it's very accurate, John. I mean, I think it's a perceptive comment, and it's a very accurate comment. I mean, the fact is that a world in which journalism is either fettered or doesn't exist is a world of half-truths. It's a world of outright lies in some circumstances. It's a world where crimes can go undetected. It's a world without information and a world without witnesses. And it's a world also without a universally recognised sense of ownership of your individual destiny. And for me, totally unimaginable that we should live in that kind of world. And I think that, people would be, it will become very angry if they feel as though their journalism, the public interest journalism that they receive is being fettered in any way, because then they have no power over systems and policies, and governments begin to rule them rather than partner with people. There's a reason why we have journalism. There's a reason why we have whistleblowers, for example, who are prepared to get to the truth. People like Ed Snowden, who's now forced to live in Russia. People like Julian Assange, who is currently before the courts, perhaps not right now because of coronavirus, but has been before the courts in proceedings to extradite him to the United States. But people who find information and bring it to light, information that governments don't want exposed to the light of day. And so, whenever you begin to curtail media freedom or to impinge upon the ability of journalists to do precisely what they should be doing, which is exposing those half-truths and those lies and those injustices and those crimes against humanity, as soon as you begin to fetter that ability, then you have the prospect of of democracy being quite severely eroded because people no longer have the choice. Information is power. We have the ability to make the world a better place, it's very easy, I think, for people to think that they live in a bubble and that they're not. If they don't have information, then it's easy for them to reinforce their own ideas, their own prejudices, to go to the internet and Google up something and find something that accords with what they believe, and then that becomes the truth without anything to challenge it. So we need journalism to challenge our ideas. We need journalism to help us progress and to put reforms in place.
As a reporter, you've reported on and written about the collapse of Soviet communism, civil wars across the old Soviet Union, including the First Chechen War, and the personalities such as Gorbachev and Yeltsin. You've lived almost through an arc in history. I mean, the West after that period hailed a new world order of individual freedom. One even wrote about the end of history. But over the last decade, we seem to have forgotten much of that. We've entered a period of populism where freedom has become ultra-individualism and facts can be individually interpreted. And it seems media changes have been central, from social media to Rupert Murdoch. I mean, do you ever shake your head wishing to wake up?
Oh, look, every day. But a lot has happened in those 10 years as well. So we've had the rise of social media, which has had an impact. It was once hailed, and when it began, it was in fact a kind of democratizing influence in media. But now it's become, this crazy beast that operates in its own world and according to its own rules and laws, and none of that bears much resemblance to the way traditional media operates. So that has had a really, I think, overall, I wouldn't say negative, but I think it's had an impact. And there needs to be some kind of regulation or boundary around it that will enforce some degree of civility and proper fact-checking, if you like. I mean, things just get out of hand on social media in terms of mis and disinformation. I mean, that is where you find it, because that is where it begins. Unfortunately, it doesn't end there, though. But I think that there are many other factors that have forced people around the world to look to more conservative governments. And particularly in the part of the world that I'm most familiar with, which is Russia and Eastern Europe, for example, I think that they went through their unbridled capitalistic phase of it being such a wonderful thing to be so free, to be able to do business, go anywhere you want, travel anywhere you want, accumulate as much as you want, earn as much as you want. And then at the same time, a lot of people getting left behind, which is what happens in capitalist societies. But in those countries, it was more noticeable because they had come from decades and decades where culturally they were used to people more or less being all together, of people being poor all together at the same time, except for the elite. So I think that, they went through this period of having everything there and available to them, and then all of a sudden realising, wow, it's not so good actually. I mean, if you lose your job, you lose your pay. And then how do you pay for the electricity and the gas and the phone and the travel, all the things, certainly the utilities that you never had to pay for under a communist system, you suddenly had to pay for in a capitalist system. So there were all these kind of pressure points that came with being an unbridled capitalist state, for example, in Russia. And people started to think about it a little bit, And as well, at the same time, it unleashed social forces that communism had kept glued together. And so it was very easy for people then to begin to reminisce about the times when they had very strong law and order. And then they began to look for somebody who could provide that strong law and order. And lo and behold, in Russia's case, who do they find? They find Vladimir Putin. Or Viktor Orban in Hungary, and the other, almost all of the former Soviet aligned states have now got reasonably hardline leaders. So to me, it's not necessarily
that Erdogan in Turkey is following, and a model
Erdogan
that
in
Erdogan is
Turkey.
taking. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. So I don't think it's at all surprising, and I think history shows us that there is an arc of history that you referred to earlier, and that there is a chance that will all at some point disappear, or it will give way to another phase. I don't know when that will happen. I mean, it might take the lead of some Western nations for that to happen. And if we look at what's happening in the United States, maybe we need to see Trump topple before there could be any change anywhere else. I don't know.
Well, perhaps I could ask you just very briefly, by way of finishing that, winding it up. We're witnessing a collapse of commercial media of all sorts here in Australia, and at the same time, a sort of naked political attack on the funding base of our national broadcasters. How concerned should we be here?
Oh, I think we should be very concerned. Oh, I think we should be very, very worried. Very worried. I mean, I think what the ABC has shown us throughout its entire history, actually, is the public service that it plays. And the public interest journalism that it produces, without which we would be a much, much poorer nation and a much, much poorer democracy. And if you look at what the ABC has done, even in the last few months with the bushfires first and then COVID-19, where would we have been? Would we have been relying on some commercial entities that thought it was fit to publish full-page advertisements from a very rich Queenslander, Clive Palmer, talking about bringing in a drug which he claimed would cure COVID-19, that has been unproven, and in fact most medicos say this anti-malaria drug actually is very dangerous. Would it leave us with another oligarch from Western Australia, Gina Rinehart, telling us all about how if you drink a glass of hot lemon juice in the morning, that'll clear coronavirus out of your system? I mean, you need a very strong public broadcaster at all times, but particularly in times of crisis. And the ABC has been losing funding year on, year out for a very, very long time, as we discovered today. And the fact that it is now having to look at the next 5 years and plan life without the same level of funding is an absolutely frightening prospect.
Professor Monica Attard, UTS, thanks so much for joining us on this Ramadan Conversation.
You're welcome.
You're with Ramadan Conversations, brought to you by the Affinity Foundation. Well, Mehmet, it's time now to turn to our next guest. And joining us from America tonight is exiled journalist Abdulhamid Bilici. Abdulhamid was once one of the most prominent and influential media figures in Turkey, as the former editor-in-chief of Zaman, the country's most widely circulated newspaper, which had a daily circulation of over 1 million people. Following the failed 2016 coup, Bilici's newspaper was raided and closed by the government, and under the threat of an arrest, he was forced into exile. Bilici now lives in Washington, DC, where he pieces together an income as an Uber driver. He has spoken in conferences in more than 20 states in America and is a frequent commentator on television channels such as BBC, CBS, and Al Jazeera. Abdulhamid Bilici, welcome to this Ramadan Conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for invitation and the opportunity to talk to you.
Abdulhamid, Turkey was once talked about as the ideal Muslim majority nation where Islam and modernity productively coexisted. Since 2010, and particularly after the so-called coup, many of those democratic structures seem to be under challenge as far more restrictive political regime has emerged. What role did the media, for good or ill, play in these changes? I mean, Zaman, your newspaper, for example, was once a voice independent of government. How has all that changed? To what extent, for example, is media ownership and control now effectively under government close supervision or even control?
So when we consider Turkey, we should remember that it was never a perfect democracy. So it was almost always struggling to be a democracy with human rights, press freedom, and the other requirements of real democracy. So in early 2000 until 2010, Turkey was a kind of rising star as a model of Muslim democracy under the leadership of Erdogan. And in those years, Turkey was almost fulfilling criteria to be a European Union member, which means a real democracy. In those years, Turkey was seen as a good example of bringing Islam and democracy together in a successful country. And Turkey had a very nice location to play such a role. It is between Asia and Europe. It has a history of Islam, and it has a history of Roman Empire. So it was a very exciting moments indeed. And my newspaper was also a very important supporter of that orientation, that perspective. So we were supporting Turkey to be a European member and to be a real democracy. But I mean, suddenly, after 2010, 2011, the same ruling party and Erdogan changed course, changed direction dramatically from a European, from a democratic orientation to an autocratic orientation. And in that process, of course, as a responsible media, we did not accept that new direction, that new perspective, and we were critical of that. But the media, unfortunately, in those years, beginning from the 2007, 8, 9, was being more and more controlled by the ruling party, by the government, which was very important for I mean, for let's say brainwashing people to change their orientations from a democratic perspective into an autocratic perspective. And now, when we started to criticize some of the policies of the government, of course, we faced persecution, oppression, and a lot of pressures. Not just we, all the critical media, starting in 2013, and a lot of our reporters lost their accreditations to follow government events, and a call from the government to not to buy our newspaper, and a lot of court cases against our reporters, columnists, our institution. So we found ourselves in a very tough spot, and of course, at that time, Erdogan, the leader of the ruling party AKP, was able to control an important amount of media, especially public media, and the media that he changed the ownership through some contracts given to associated business people, and then asking them to buy ownership of certain important influential medias, and then appointing to those medias his close friends as editors. So that accumulated an important media power for Erdogan, and that has been an important factor in changing Turkey from a democracy into an autocracy. Indeed, this is where we are now. I like to correct one point in the introduction. You underlined that my newspaper, yes, you said it was the largest circulated newspaper, but it was silenced not after the coup, but before the coup attempt in July 16. In March 16, indeed, 4 or 5 months before this infamous coup attempt, and other critical media groups, newspapers, TV channels were also silenced, even in 2015. So we can see that there has been already a trend in controlling first the ownership of media and then silencing critical voices, and it peaked with the coup attempt in July 15. Then, of course, it became much more notorious when more than 200 media outlets, radio stations, news agencies, newspapers, television channels were shut down altogether, and then which created a media that is 95% controlled by one person and one party. So now, I mean, Turkey is in a very terrible situation, which is the worst jailer of journalists. I mean, now we are celebrating World Press Freedom Day, but there are more than 150 of my colleagues in jail, and Turkey ranks 154 in the World Press Freedom Index, which 180th country. The last country is North Korea, and we are 154, which is not a good ranking to be proud of. Of course, there is a very important correlation between controlling media and the quality of democracy. So they go hand in hand. When you don't have free media, you can't talk about democracy. When you put journalists behind jails, behind bars, you can't talk about democracy. And so when you convert a media, the public media, private media, all sorts of media into kind of propaganda machine, you can't talk anymore about democracy. This is what we witnessing now. What we are witnessing now, unfortunately.
It's a very articulate explanation, and you've covered almost what we had in two questions there in one. But Mehmet, perhaps you'd like to ask the next question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a question. I mean, it is World Press Freedom Day, and the question why Turkey from ninth position in the World Press Index in 2002 to 154th this year in the space of 20 years during the Erdogan regime. Even though Erdogan regime was very successful in the first 10 years, as you said, 2002 to 2010, the world, from a journalistic perspective, from a media perspective, it was always criticized, even though in those times of great democratic regimes that it had. I mean, I took a group of Australian journalists to Turkey in 2009, and even at that time they were saying that there is no proper press freedom in Turkey, especially when it came to Kurdish or Alewi groups and other minority groups in Turkey. Can you explain a bit about why Turkey dropped so much? I know Turkey has never had a proper democracy, but from 99th position when he came into power to 154th is pretty damn low, pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, as I tried to explain in my response to the first question, there are two phases of AKP, or the ruling party. One is from 2002 until 2010-11, and then from 2011 to today. So there is a sharp contrast in those two periods. One was Turkey aspiring to be similar to European Western democracies, and in the second phase, it is getting every day similar to countries in Asia, in Middle East, like Syria, Iran, or to the other example of North Korea. So I think that is a very important turning point, which is in 2010. One of the important figures of the AKP, the ruling party, said in 2010 that they were walking with liberals and Democrats until that time. But the guy who was the chairman of AKP in Istanbul, which is an important position, who was saying that from now on, since 2010, we will not be walking with those friends like Democrats and liberals, but we will continue to have another program, another perspective, another ideology. And why? Why that change? So when I believed sincerely that this party and Erdogan aiming to make Turkey a real democracy, and many people believe that, not just my newspaper. You know, when I look at the editorials of New York Times or Le Monde or Washington Post, you could see a lot of very positive coverage of Erdogan and his party and what they were doing. And Obama, for instance, a democratic president, was in love almost with Erdogan. And European Union countries were very much appreciating what Erdogan was doing. In those years, we were also thinking that Erdogan sincerely a Democrat. But now, after witnessing all those tragedy, that I mean, jailing journalists, shutting down newspapers, TV channels, and then creating a one-man rule, I look at retrospectively and see that in those years, in the early years, AKP and Erdogan was in need of the support of Democrats, liberals, the European Union, America, Western democracies, because in those years, in the early years, there was a huge crisis of legitimacy of Erdogan vis-a-vis the establishment, the secular establishment. Secular establishment was not happy from day one about him, about his party, and about their intentions. But they were seeing him as a threat to secular characteristic of the republic. So, as a counterbalance, Erdogan acted as a Democrat and got the support of Democrats and liberals in Turkey, and meanwhile Hizmet movement also, and of course whole the Western countries and democracies. But when Erdogan came to a point that took the control over this secular establishment, and then he switched back to his original ideology, which is political Islamism. You know, we need to go back a little bit about the time that Erdogan was the mayor of Istanbul. You know, Erdogan, when he started his political career in early 90s, he was a political Islamist, and he was saying that the European Union is a Christian club and Turkey has no place there. And he was saying that Turkey, I mean, democracy is a tramway, and you use it until your destination, and then you leave it. So this is where Erdogan backtracked. You know, after controlling these, secular establishment, the military, the judiciary, and other sources of power that were balancing Erdogan's drive through an authoritarian and Islamist approach. And then when he felt that he has enough power to go back to his original ideology, then he went there. So this is what we are witnessing. Of course, on top of that, you need to add the corruption aspect. You know, AKP founded on a claim, on an idea of being not a corrupt party. Ak means white in Turkish, you know, which means a party without corruption. But in 2013, we learned after an important investigation, that all his family members and the ministers were very much corrupted and very badly corrupted. And when this was exposed, of course, in my view, the Erdogan had two options. One was to go to court and respond against the allegations against him, and let the due process of judiciary, the courts, continue. This was the first option. And the other option was to destroy democracy, to destroy judiciary, to destroy free media. And Erdogan, unfortunately, picked the second option, and he destroyed all his chances to be a rising figure of a Muslim democrat leader around the world, which was very much needed. You know, when you look at the Muslim world, there is not a single example of a good functioning democracy. So Turkey was the closest candidate, and Erdogan could be a person in history books as a person helping achieving that goal. But unfortunately, with this corruption and with his earlier ideology, the political Islamism, which is not in line with the principles, any principles of democracy, so unfortunately, we lost our democracy in not overnight, of course. It is a process. It's a gradual process. It may be started, as you reminded, in 2008, in 2009. There were some early signals of destruction of democracy, but it speeded up after 2013, and it is almost totally crashed after 2016 coup. But I think Turkey was an important example of a rising Muslim democracy, and that could be a good example for good relations between the West and the East, between Muslim world and the Christian world, which was very much fitting to Turkey's location on the map. But now, of course, Turkey unfortunately lost that chance. But Turkey is another example now of how democracies could be hijacked in a very short time. How what are the
that's a point that I might ask another couple of questions, because we'll be dwelling on some of that a little later. But we are pressed for time. So, Mehmet, you've got a personal question for Abdulhamid that we might drop in here, and we'll keep it reasonably brief.
Yeah. Abdulhamid Bey, at a personal level, in just 5 years, your world was overturned. You were very famous. Someone has approached you and 5 years ago and told you that you would lose your freedom, your career, and you would be exiled in a foreign country, and you would be driving an Uber to pay your bills. You might have thought they've gone crazy. However, you're a witness to this process, and how does that make you feel?
Yeah, this is one of the topics of my speeches at the conferences that I attend in different states in America, at the colleges or some NGOs or think tanks. I start telling that democracies are fragile, and they could be destroyed, they could be hijacked. So I'm speaking not as an academic, not as a theoretician, but as a practitioner who witnessed how democracies are destroyed, not in 19th century, not in 20th century, but in the 21st century.
Yes.
So that is a historic, position for me to witness all that. I mean, of course, there's a personal side of the story. I mean, all my life almost destroyed. All my lovely friends whom I worked together more than 20 years are in jail now. So, of course, I lost all my 40 years, 50 years of assets. I mean, I'm now in exile, as it is underlined in the introduction. I do Uber to pay the bills because I have a family, I have a responsibility towards them. So personally, this is drastic, but I feel myself fortunate because at least I am free, at least I am not in jail, and at least I am able to speak out and tell to the world that what's happening back in Turkey, and not just for Turkish people, but whole people in the world that could repeat same mistakes. So this is my message. I mean, I try to use this opportunity, the sufferings that I am going through, to turn it into a kind of lesson to myself, because I also did some mistakes in those good times that I was an editor of the largest newspaper. This is a learning process first for myself, and it is a historic opportunity for anyone that I am interacting to listen to me and to take a closer look at what happened in Turkey in just 5-7 years, to learn a lot of lessons about the nature of democracy, nature of populist leaders, how they come to power, how they influence their constituencies, people, how they became popular despite of their corruption, how they took control of media in a gradual manner. So there are lots of lessons that I share in those conferences that I attend. I try to write sometimes articles to that purpose. But of
Well,
course, I don't feel myself alone,
Abdulhamid,
because
lots of
yeah, sorry.
people are beginning to take notice of what you are saying, of your experience. I mean, we've got one example of your experience in the United States, where the Virginia House of Delegates welcomed you and journalist Adam Yusef after Delegate Mark Sickles gave a 1-minute speech on the lack of press freedom in Turkey. Um, if I can ask you finally, and we just have a look at this little clip, how did you feel in the moment as your home country declared you as a terrorist, while in the Virginia House you were being applauded as a humane journalist? Just have a look at the clip, and in a brief 1 minute, can you tell us what thoughts were running through your mind as you heard that tribute? Let's have a look at that now.
The clerk shall announce the next order of business.
Madam Speaker.
Delegate from Fairfax, Delegate Sickles.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Wanted to get in the last here in the first morning hour. I rise for an introduction.
Delegate Sickles, you have the floor.
Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I rise today to introduce my friends and some brave citizens from the American-Turkish Friendship Association who live in Fairfax County. These fearless men and women are originally from Turkey and are part of the exiled, investigated, and stateless journalists and reporters and media workers from Turkey in the diaspora. President Erdogan of Turkey ordered a purge against civil society members after a failed coup attempt, resulting in the dismissal, detention, and arrest of more than 650,000 people, including academics, judges, businessmen, journalists. According to Reporters Without Borders' 2019 World Press Freedom Index, Turkey ranks 155 out of 180 countries, making them one of the worst for press freedom. As a friend of the Turkish American community, I stand with these courageous journalists and applaud their efforts in raising awareness of the absence of press freedom in Turkey, and I hope they will stand and you will welcome them to the Capitol.
Thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy your day today here in Richmond.
Abdulhamid, just finally, people are beginning to listen.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I felt very much humbled by this very warm welcome and their applauses of the delegates. And it was very conflicting views and feelings in my mind, because I was seen as terrorist by my own country, and then appreciated very much by another country, which is an important democracy. And I feel myself as a person sincerely struggling for democracy of people all around the world, not just Turkish people, but for all people in the world. And I think this was a kind of encouragement for my courage and for my values, and for my efforts to raise awareness about persecution, which is not limited to just media, not just journalists. A lot, thousands of academics lost their jobs, judges, lawyers in jail, teachers lost their jobs, a lot of them tortured to death. So, I mean, I continue speaking out in the name of all the persecuted people, all the oppressed people. So I'm not against my country. I love my country. I love my people. Although this ruling party, labels me as a enemy of state, I am a lover of my country. I am a lover of my people, and I try to. I am just against wrong things. Like I am against dictatorship. I am against autocracy. I am against corruption. I am not against Turkey. I am not against Turkish people. So
And
I
that's
think
probably the
this
place
is.
we're going to have to leave this. I'm sorry to cut you off there, but it's just been a real privilege to have you with us this evening. And Mehmet, I'm sure you want to thank Abdulhamid Bidici as well.
Salamat Bey, thank you very much appreciated. Very wise answers. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, Mehmet, our final guest tonight is an old friend of mine, Professor Peter Manning. Currently, he's an adjunct professor at the University of Technology in Sydney, following a distinguished 30-year career in ABC television journalism. He's been head of current affairs at the Seven Network, head of ABC Radio National, head of ABC Television News and Current Affairs. Additionally, Peter was executive producer of the multi-award-winning institution that is Four Corners on ABC television. And prior to that, he'd been a television, radio and print reporter in ABC TV and radio and the Sydney Morning Herald and the Bulletin. A long career. Peter, it's too much to recall and a great pleasure to welcome you.
Oh, John, none of this old friend. I think we're still friends. That'll do.
You've been involved in journalism in Australia since the 1970s, from a time when media licenses were licensed to print money, as they used to say. All that has changed very quickly in the past few years. What are the most striking changes for you, and what concerns do they raise?
Numbers of concerns. On the micro level, I've got problems with Facebook. I've got problems with a younger generation than me, and I don't think this is being anti-young generation, who are committing themselves to print in a kind of old-fashioned way through Facebook and other social media, and really they haven't come through the kind of training that many people before them have, and their literary skills really deficient. And I think a lot of misunderstanding happens, particularly when it comes to policy development, in people trying to, talk about major issues. And not only that, but Facebook also has its own bias, which is not something that I think most of the young people I know will attest to. So that's at that level. At the higher level, I think our media is being diminished at a great rate, and the ethics and the code of ethics and so on that the unions used to make sure that we stuck by. I think all that's gone out the door, and the readers as consumers has taken over, the ethic of what good journalism is about, and it simply is not worth the money to be going out and doing investigative journalism of the kind that we did in the 1980s and 90s. So I think it's a very dangerous period, and I think it links up to the kinds of things that your previous guest there was talking about, which is populism, nativism, and fake journalism.
Mehmet, perhaps you'd like to ask the next question of Peter.
Yeah, Peter, you and I, as you know, have been on a study tour of Turkey in 2007. I took you to the most wonderful places, and you visited a country which had a vibrant media at that time. You were in love with the Zaman newspaper at that time, I remember, and it was a very healthy civil society. Today, and I just wanted to highlight that you were reading Today's Zaman every day. I remember at one stage. Today we're seeing a rise of authoritarianism in Turkey, of which Turkey is one of the examples around the world, but there are many others. And it seems that it's not simply explicable in terms of a Muslim society struggling with democracy, as Turkey is. The same authoritarian tendencies are evident in staunchly Catholic Poland, as reported on the ABC's Foreign Correspondent program this week. What do you make of it?
That's true.
What do you make of this?
Well, I think that there's a sort of worldwide movement to refine one's roots and refine what makes Polish people Polish, and I think that's a failure of globalization, really. And I think people are taken with the great speakers who get up there and talk about their own life and their own country and their own nation and so on and so on. So really this process of othering other people as though they're not one of us is basically what I've spent the last 20 years of my life academically trying to look at. How does this happen? And I think it's rampant now. And of course, the role of Turkey in being the democratic Muslim country has got lost, and places, but that's not the end of it. Places like Indonesia, also a Muslim country, but also a very maybe chaotic, but very much a functioning democracy. And again, Malaysia, a Muslim country, but maybe chaotic and not quite as democratic as you'd like it to be. But I don't think the mix between being Muslim and being democratic is ever under suspicion. I don't think there's anything that is in the Quran that stops Muslim countries from being democratic. I think it's very much other factors than that. And it would have been good if Turkey had continued down the line that it was, because I think it could have, been a very generous aid to many of the countries in the Middle East and been a model. And it's a great shame that has happened.
Peter, I pick up that point that Mehmet just made about the interesting comparison. You've got what's happening in Turkey and you've got what's happening in Poland, a Catholic country which is becoming very authoritarian as well. It's an interesting paradox, isn't it, that media freedom and religious freedom are often linked. Most often over recent years, it's seen as they mutually demonize each other. That religious groups blame cynical journalists, and cynical journalists look on sort of authoritarian religious groups. Yet they're also inextricably linked through a necessary commitment to freedom of thought and belief. And it's paradoxically something that the purists in both groups demonize in the other.
Yes, yes, that's true. Yes, it is. I mean, it's ironic, isn't it, that in our allegedly democratic country today in Australia, there's a major petition which is going to the government about freedom of speech for journalists. At the moment, that the MEAA is getting together, and when they go through the 10 points of what's happened since September 11 and the laws that have come in to restrict journalists, it's terrifying. It actually puts us on the same level as many fascist countries, and I've got to say, it really worries me where Australia is going itself, and where America is going, for that matter, with Trump. You know, I think he's a classic populist and nativist, and is isolating America, the United States, from the rest of the world. And of course, you know, that great city, New York, has been an inspiration to so many people.
Free media around the world, as you indicate, seems to be under challenge from both within and without. Industry groups themselves, like Fox Media, shape their news to suit political ends to make money. Social media, as you've indicated, is undermining the platform of mainstream media. Facebook and Google need global regulation at a time when people are retreating from that very thing.
Yes.
And public broadcasters like the ABC are having their editorial independence challenged by government and police, and at the same time their budgets are savaged. Are we putting our fundamental political and religious freedoms at risk?
I think we are very much, and I think it's being encouraged by the shock jocks in our radio stations, who have got very high ratings, and who point out virtually who are the people that we should be hating today. You know,
Yes.
I mean, it's not ethical. It's not Christian. It's not. It's got no kind of religious structure behind it whatsoever. And yet you hear people coming on air on, you know, these radio stations, ready to fight. You know, Cronulla riots, another Cronulla riot, and I've written about that in a book called Us and Them that I brought out in 2006. Not long after we went on the Mehmet Saral tour of Turkey, which was so wonderful. But you know, the question of how easy it's become to pick up someone and make them the other, you know, and you know, I think that's initially what happened with Muslim people after a lot of the migration to Australia of Muslim refugees from the attacks by Israel on Lebanon, but also the attempts by so many people to demonize others. I think luckily Muslims are not in Australia, in Sydney, are not being demonized these days as much. Why? Because China is now the great, site of purest white hatred, and
Yes, and
by
it's
the
not
way,
just for political reasons or racial reasons. It's because,
No.
according to Donald
No.
Trump, they're the source of something
Yeah.
else as well.
Well, he's using race to get to the next election, isn't he? Really, obviously, and he wants all his supporter base to kind of take on the Chinese. That's where he's heading. And I think really when you look at some of the anti-Chinese works that's being published in the Sydney Morning Herald, for heaven's sake, and the Australian, and some of the alleged academic books that are coming out, the Chinese are suddenly rescuing the Muslims of Sydney who've put up with so much rubbish for the last 22 decades, and are taking it on. But I think from a Chinese point of view, meaning the continent of China, I think they must think, where is that Australia that's kind of biting my bum? It's kind of like ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And I don't think China would be worried too much about Australia, but Australia is very much worried about, and this is something we go through we in Australia go through like every 20 years. Prior to Arab and Muslim Australians 20 years ago, the Vietnamese were, of course, the great other, because they were allegedly in, Campbelltown and places like that, with their triads and all the rest of it. And we had the Vietnamese for about a decade, and going back to the Greeks and the Italians and Germans and so on. So we've got a history.
Don't forget the Irish.
The Irish,
and the Irish. Yeah, but that was probably true. They probably were, more Irish friends. And that's me saying.
We're going to have to wind this conversation up in just a second. But quite seriously, if the media, for commercial reasons, are complicit in this othering that you talk about, because it does help some of them make money, what are we to do? What are the citizens to do? I mean, join the Friends of the ABC, perhaps, but quite seriously.
No, I think I think the communities that cop this kind of treatment have to be patient and have to wear it for a while they rise through the ranks demographically and become, the middle class and the professional, people throughout our institutions. And I noticed that the ABC now is seemingly full of Indian and Chinese and so on, and that's great, absolutely great, because it breaks down this us and them sort of notion, and I think that's the best way, one way of doing it. Yeah.
Peter Manning, great to talk with you. You and Mehmet probably have a few other sort of old war stories to catch up on, and perhaps we should leave that for another day.
Look forward to seeing
you. You're
looking
looking shockingly healthy, John.
Feeling wonderful, Peter. We must catch up for lunch one day, when all this is over.
This is true.
Professor Peter Manning, thank you for joining us for this Ramadan conversation. Well, Mehmet, that's just about all we have time for in today's program. Thanks for being part of the team this evening. A very busy evening. I look forward to catching up again soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. It's very nice to be on the show.
Well, and thank you all at home or wherever you happen to be for joining this Ramadan conversation. Our next episode will be tomorrow, and will be another very special episode as we travel internationally once more to Rome. After the past week, our conversations have featured a number of well-known guests, and if you wish to view this or any of the series of Ramadan conversations, you can find them on the Affinity YouTube channel. Stay safe. Have a blessed Ramadan.